people in. But yes, hello everyone, and welcome to this ParliON event to mark Social Mobility Awareness Day, which is today. And as you can see, I'm quite excited about it. If you're only taking part in one activity today to raise awareness of social mobility, you have chosen the right one, as this one is going to be a cracker of an event. First of all, let me tell you who we are. For any of you who, for whom this is your first ParliON event. So I am Claire. I am one of the co-chairs of ParliON, which is Parliament's workplace equality network supporting social mobility and equality of opportunity, with the ON standing for Opportunity Network. As we often do, we have also invited the cross-government socio-economic diversity network to this event. So are joined by a large number of civil service colleagues, which is why we have so many beeps as people join this call. But it's no surprise that there are so many civil servants who want to be here with us today. As our first speaker, Professor Sam Friedman is the author of the 2021 groundbreaking study into socio-economic background and career progression in the civil service, the Navigating the Labyrinth report, which Sam will be talking to us about today. Our second speaker, Nik Miller, is CEO of the Bridge Group and has also researched the civil service, publishing his work into socio-economic background in the FAST stream in 2016, and more recently, Nik led a pioneering study for KPMG published at the end of last year, which looked across diversity characteristics and found that social class is now the biggest barrier to career progression. And this really makes clear how important it is for organisations to be tackling social mobility now if they want to be truly inclusive employers. Now, many of you will have also read Sam's seminal book, Class Ceiling, and if you have, you will know that Nik wrote the epilogue to that book, which demonstrates how well Nik and Sam's work complements each other. And I think we will see and really benefit from that today, particularly with Sam's research and depth of knowledge in this area, and Nik being able to add the practical know-how to address issues and make meaningful change. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say, and there will be time at the end for questions and discussion on what they raise. So I will stop talking now, apart from asking you all to please keep your microphones on mute unless you're speaking, and use the chat bar for questions and comments at any point during this event, and we will try and respond to as many of you as we can at the end. We are recording this event for those who can't attend, and with that I will bring up Sam's PowerPoint. Should pop up now. And pass over to Sam. Let me see if I can just put it on slideshow. Okay, Sam, over to you. Is that up?
Yeah, is it up as a slideshow? I'm sort of seeing it slightly differently, but if everyone else can see it fine, that's good. Thanks so much for the invitation, Claire. And apologies, I have a new laptop and this is the first time I've tried to use it to do a presentation, and inevitably it's not working. So I'm afraid this is going to be quite extensive Chris Whitty on the slides changing. But I wanted just to tell you a bit about this report that I did on social mobility in the civil service in 2021. My hope really is that there are sort of obvious crossovers here between the civil service and Parliament that means that at least some of these findings resonate with your experience, and perhaps lead you to ask similar questions or to push for similar types of evidence in Parliament. So if we could change the slide. So the civil service has led the way in many ways in terms of social mobility in recent years, including on the FAST stream, which I know Nik is going to talk about later. But so far, these interventions have largely focused on outreach and recruitment, in other words, on who gets in. So in this project, we really wanted to shift the focus from access to progression, to ask how does a person's socioeconomic background affect who gets on in the civil service. So if we could change the slide, now. And we tackled that question really in two stages. First, we examined the people survey data that the civil service holds, looking at all 4 collected measures of socioeconomic background that are detailed on this slide, but focusing in particular on parental occupation. Based on those results, we then followed up with 100 or so interviews with staff, kind of senior, grade 7 and above, in 4 specific departments. So we looked at transport, HMRC, Treasury and Cabinet Office, and the reason why we chose them will come clearer as I go through the presentation. And these were really aimed to capture a kind of broadly representative picture of each department in terms of socioeconomic background and other characteristics. So moving on, if we could move to the next slide and the one after that, how socioeconomically diverse is the civil service? Well, this first graph answers that by taking answers to the parental occupation question and then separating civil servants' origins into these 3 ONS socioeconomic classes. So first, you can see those whose main breadwinning parent did professional managerial work. Second, those whose parents did intermediate jobs. So that's kind of shop owners, secretaries. You might think of these as kind of lower middle class jobs. And finally, those whose parents did.
Sorry to interrupt, but the slides aren't moving. We can only see the PowerPoint. I think you might be.
I'm the same. I was wondering. I was hoping other people could see them.
Okay, let me try again. Where am I?
Claire, I was going to say, if you click on present in Teams, it should hopefully work that way. There should be an option at the top.
Or if you look under share under PowerPoint Live,
so
you've got the slides open.
Yeah, I will do it from PowerPoint Live, which is
and then some might be able to take control directly.
Oh, that would be exciting. Sorry, just to reiterate, this is definitely my problem, not Claire's. Sorry, Claire.
Let me
We're creative people, we can work this out.
yeah,
This is all.
I would usually in protected view. I think you need to enable editing and then it should pop up as present live.
Have I taken it completely off now?
Yeah, there's no slide showing. Yeah.
There's still a slide showing.
No slides showing.
Okay.
You could forward the presentation to someone else if that's helpful. Who might be
so annoying. I just did a presentation this morning and it went perfectly fine, but I cannot find these slides in my PowerPoint Live.
Claire, do you want to forward them to me, Claire?
Okay.
See if.
Yeah.
Charlie Robbie Jones. Have you remembered about the gin tour?
Okay, so I'll send them to you, Zara, and see if you can open it. How very annoying. Apologies, Sam. Like I said, I did a presentation this morning. It worked perfectly fine, but I cannot find this one on my.
No, it's I'm sorry, it's my fault.
Quite right, Gary.
But I wonder if I just bring it up like that without going to slideshow. Can you see that slide?
I can see that slide. People from higher socio-economic backgrounds are overrepresented.
Yeah.
It will mean keeping these on the left-hand side of the screen, unfortunately, but
Claire, just FYI, I don't know if you can hear me. This is what the view that we had before. So we could see it as if you were presenting from your view of the slides.
Okay.
You could see the slides on the left, but they just weren't changing.
Have you?
Okay, well, I'm going to control them. I'm going to control them from PowerPoint now rather than from Teams. So hopefully it should move. Is that okay?
Said if you do enable editing, that might help.
But yeah, you can if you present from directly within PowerPoint, that's fine. We can still see it.
Yeah, I hate to say it, enable editing has meant we now can't see them. I think we were all right where we were before, but a bit suboptimal. You know,
we're going to get there in the end. Oh no,
best is the enemy of the good.
Time that we wanted for discussion at the end, but let me try again. Here we go. Now, so I've enabled editing. Can you see? You can see that slide.
Yes.
Okay.
And can you
I
move
will just
it there?
change it
Yeah.
from here.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, shall I crack on?
Yes, crack on.
Okay.
Sorry, Sam.
No, I should be apologising. Sorry, everyone. So this slide here, this is basically what this is showing you, which probably isn't a surprise to many people on the call, is that when you look at the civil service workforce, it's significantly tilts towards those from privileged backgrounds compared to the UK as a whole, and to a lesser extent other professions and the public sector. But this, of course, these kind of overall figures hide variation in various ways. So first by region. So if we go to the next slide, you can see here that civil servants working in London are significantly more likely to be from advantaged backgrounds. It also hides variation by department. If we go to the next slide, where you can see, for example, that the Treasury and departments, yeah, you can see that as significantly more exclusive. And then finally, you can see that this hides really in some ways the most important finding, which is variation by grade. So this, I think, in some ways is the most important graph to take away. It shows that the civil service gets more exclusive at every grade of seniority, and actually, notably here, we can also make an albeit limited comparison over time, drawing on collection of data from the senior civil service that was done back in 1967. And tellingly, this shows that actually the proportion of senior civil service from high socioeconomic backgrounds is actually slightly higher today than it was over 50 years ago. But I would stress, and we do in the report, this is partly driven by the fact that there are many more people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds today than there were in 1967, changes in the economy. One final point of note, the progression gap you see on this slide shows up whatever background measure we use. Okay, so for example, the privately educated also become more prevalent at higher grades, as to those whose parents had degree level education. But if we move to the next slide, I think what's interesting to some extent about these progression gaps is that they don't necessarily show a ceiling, more that those from working class backgrounds consistently drop off at every grade. And so I want to suggest, and have done in the report, that I think a more apt metaphor is the idea of the civil service as a labyrinth. This better captures, I think, its tremendous size and complexity, the fact that progression is not simple or direct, and more importantly, the idea that while there is a viable route to the centre, this route is largely hidden. Indeed, I was repeatedly told in interviews, if we move to the next one, that there is both a formal set of guidelines around progression in the civil service and an informal set. And as Mark underlines here, while the formal processes are often very sensitive to issues of equity, it's really the hidden rules that often drive promotion decisions. And just to move on to the next slide, I think more significantly for this research, it's in unpacking these hidden rules where we found that those from working class or low socioeconomic backgrounds face the strongest barriers. So these in mind, I want to briefly touch on some of these barriers, but I might just for time purposes skip a few. But the first is that there are really kind of accelerator pathways through the labyrinth. If we move to the next slide, and these are often referred to in interviews, as Aaron notes here, as the velvet drain pipe. And a few people mention this. I'd never heard it before, which is a sort of particular progression path through the civil service. And there are 5 types of accelerator roles that seem to come out from interviews. First, an early posting in a private office. Second, experience in a central department like the Treasury or Cabinet Office. Third, experience running a bill team. 4, securing a leading role during a national crisis. And 5, landing a role in a minister's private office, particularly as a private secretary. All of these, I was told, not only provide kind of valuable face time with key ministers and senior civil servants, but also provide experience on the most high-profile work streams. But what was striking was that actually awareness of these accelerator roles, these hidden tracks, was highly stratified by socioeconomic background. Why is that? Well, what interviews were indicating is that this is largely about who has access to what we call in the report organizational guides, senior colleagues who impart that valuable informal information. And significantly, these guide relationships, which Nick and I have found in various other types of employment settings too, are often, not always, but often forged in the first place based on a kind of class cultural connection, shared leisure pursuits, shared taste, shared humour. And so as senior managers, as I showed you, are themselves disproportionately from privileged backgrounds, this type of guidance, this informal guidance, tends to advantage the already privileged. Moving on to the next slide. In navigating promotion, civil servants routinely face situations where expectations are unclear or ambiguous, and they themselves have to kind of decide what actions are appropriate. So to move to the next slide, those sorts of grey areas include interactions with hiring managers, requests for promotion and temporary promotion, whether you make a threat to leave, and how you potentially embellish job or promotion applications. And what we're really finding here is that the reactions to these kind of moments where you could interpret in various ways tended to vary strongly again by background. Those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tended to kind of lean in or exploit this ambiguity, playing the game, as Rachel notes here, to negotiate promotion opportunities. And just to give you one example of that, if we move to the next slide, conversations with hiring managers in particular, or what many called fireside chats. Here, those from advantaged backgrounds not only more actively initiated these types of interactions, but also used them more instrumentally as a kind of subtle opportunity to ingratiate, to charm gatekeepers, as Arash puts it here. In contrast, to move to the next one, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds generally expressed a kind of confusion, uncertainty in these interpretive moments, as well as actually a kind of sense of almost ethical or moral discomfort, as Jo notes here. I find the whole idea, she says, that someone needs to talk to the right people and it's not good enough that I do a good job, really, really hard. So these differing interpretations of ambiguity in the system are significant because at present, with expectations unclear, they work to unfairly advantage the progression of those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. I think I'll skip this next one, but this is about the importance of particularly working in London and proximity to Whitehall, and move just to the next one, which is that, civil servants not only saw, as you saw in those guides and those earlier graphs, into particular locations, but they also saw into particular specialties in terms of the type of work they do. So, for example, only 19% of those working in policy are from working class backgrounds, whereas they make up 40% of people working in operational roles. And this is significant if we move to the next slide, because operational career tracks often carry very strong bottlenecks in terms of progression. And this sorting process takes place in two ways, we found. First, it's driven by those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often joining the civil service at lower grades, right, that tend to be operational and then tend to progress along this track. But that can often lead to a kind of catch-22 where they need to amass experience in other work areas like policy to progress to higher grades, but their existing experience puts them at a disadvantage in applying for those roles. At the same time, and if you move to the next slide, among those who do join the civil service at higher grades like the fast stream, there was a tendency still, interestingly, to specialise in more operational areas among those from working class backgrounds. And this was often because they were seen to be more transparent, more tangible, that there was no hiding place in those operational areas, as Jeff puts it here. You have to earn your stripes, he says. In contrast, if we move to the next slide, most felt, regardless of background, that the knowledge and skills of policy work in particular was more ambiguous. Policy work, of course, demands many tangible skills, but most argued that its essence is really about demonstrating good judgment. And as Joy notes here, the inherent uncertainty of policy work, no one can really foretell the success of a particular policy proposal, places a kind of heightened emphasis on self-presentation, on nurturing an image of competency or cultivating a belief, especially among the types of ministers that you are communicating that in one's own expertise. So there's a particular premium in policy, I think, on being able to conform to what ministers and senior civil servants expect a policy civil servant to look, sound and speak like, because this kind of acts as a act almost of persuasion, a proxy for high quality advice or good judgment that's actually very difficult to definitively demonstrate in the moment. And I think this is important because it links strongly to the next area I want to look at, which is behavioural codes, and this may be an area that's of interest in terms of Parliament too. Now, clearly, the civil service is too vast to talk of one uniform culture. You have 500,000 people working there, but what we identified in interviews is that in prestigious departments like Treasury, in prestigious professions like policy, and within the senior civil service more generally, there are certain unwritten behavioural codes that seem to underpin notions of what merit looks like. If we move to the next slide, the key, I think, principle here is this idea of neutrality, which might again be of interest in terms of Parliament. Now, of course, this has a clear and legitimate function. Civil servants answer to the government of the day. Political neutrality is key to the idea of impartial public service. But what I repeatedly heard was that behavioural expectations around neutrality actually extend far beyond simply political impartiality. Neutrality seems to be valued as a more overarching disposition, a way of being, encompassing style of speaking, self-presentation, communication, even taste and lifestyle. And there's a lot of this in the report, and it is quite a subtle point, but just to kind of hone in on one area quickly on accent and style of speech, what we were finding here is that the idea of received pronunciation, RP, associated, of course, with an advantaged upbringing, is routinely read as a signal of neutrality. And so you can see in this nice quote from Isaac here, how he draws a connection between accent, okay, as well as attendant aspects of speech, speed, tone, timbre, and this wider conception of neutrality, of somehow the perception that you are able to carry out more objective analysis if you present yourself in this way. And others similarly connected this idea of neutrality to other self-presentational behaviours, to being softly spoken, calm, unflappable, emotionally detached, restrained, understated. In contrast, and to move to the next slide, regional accents were often seen to be cast, or people perceive them to be cast, as kind of impinging on this embodiment of neutrality, with those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds telling me that they often feel they're read by colleagues as aggressive or loud or too passionate. And of course, this feeling of not fitting then strongly inhibits confidence and willingness to actually push for progression. And I think you can see that quite strongly in this quote here from Lara. So I've talked a little bit about socioeconomic background in terms of parental occupation. Just one other, I think, interesting wrinkle here is that, you know, objective measures of background, as I'm sure many of these people on this call will know, don't necessarily align with how we see ourselves, right, in terms of people's own self-assessment of their backgrounds. And here, actually, the survey data was fascinating from the People survey. It showed that among those who self-identify as coming from a lower socioeconomic background, actually about 1 in 4 of those people actually have objectively quite advantaged upbringings in terms of parental occupation. How might we explain this? Well, interviews suggested to me that one key reason is that many people, if we move to the next slide, like Mike here, locate their origins less in the socioeconomic conditions of their own upbringing and instead reach back into extended family histories. And here they find stories of the past, of working class struggle, of upward social mobility, of meritocratic striving that provide powerful psychological frames for understanding their own identity. And I think that's quite understandable, but I also think one of the interesting things about that is that it can also blind those individuals to some extent from reflecting on the privileges that have actually flowed from their own upbringing. At this point, I was going to try and talk a little bit more about the fact that, of course, socioeconomic background is not the only mechanism through which people may be excluded from top jobs. And there are big sections in the report about the kind of double disadvantages for women and black civil servants from working class backgrounds. I think I'll perhaps leave it there. I was going to talk a little bit at the end about some of the recommendations from the report, but I think Nick is going to touch a bit more on some of the practical sort of policy solutions here. And if anybody does have any questions about that, then do ask them at the end. But I'll perhaps just leave it there for time purposes. And apologies again for the technical issues.
I like that there was a bit there where you were talking about people working in policy, and you said they kind of cultivate this image of competency, and I've completely failed about today. But Nick, over to you. You show us how it's meant to be done.
I think you're referring to the slides, particularly there, Claire. Yeah. There we go. Give me a reassuring nod. Fab. All right, and brilliant as always to hear you speak, Sam. And unsurprisingly, as you mentioned in the intro, Claire, there are some good bits of symmetry and build on what I'm going to share, in contrast to Sam's piece as well. And also to start by saying thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to present this afternoon. Delighted to be broadcasting live from a beautifully sunny Yorkshire. So reflecting a bit on Social Mobility Awareness Day, clearly it's encouraging that the focus on socioeconomic background in the workplace has definitely strengthened in recent years. For too long, it was a really neglected part of the diversity and inclusion conversation in the workplace. And I hope that the Bridge Group has played a sort of meaningful role in building that evidence base, using research to drive change and action. And Claire, as you said in your intro, and Sam referenced as well, the fast stream in a sense was where it all started. The fast stream was the first recruiter to really interrogate its data, its hiring practices, and to introduce a whole range of evidence-informed changes to the way in which it hired graduates. I'm not going to give you an update on where the fast stream has got to, because I really encourage colleagues on this call to go to those who are driving that change within the fast streams. But we know, as Sam said, many organisations are increasing their focus on entry-level hiring to ensure they remove barriers. And all of those initiatives are welcome. Many of them are very progressive, but entry-level hiring is only one important area in addressing overall workforce diversity. And there has been a sort of lack of focus, as Sam referenced, on progression in the workplace. We've seen, of course, pay gap reporting by class as well from organisations like Clifford Chance and KPMG, which gives us that sort of snapshot in time. And just as Sam has done, we've dedicated time at the Bridge Group to focusing on how socioeconomic background affects career progression over time, an area that was at least really understudied and is still rather badly understood. Because I think at the Bridge Group, we believe unless we track the progress that people from different socioeconomic backgrounds make through an organisation, through a career, through a sector, we can't really understand and address the barriers that are faced, those things that are leading to perpetuating lots of the inequalities Sam has already referenced. So Claire, here's how I propose just to spend the next kind of 15 minutes together. I wanted just to touch on three sort of areas of quite different research. So first of all, to look at what we know about progression and performance in financial services and the law, and particularly in the law, what we know about socioeconomic background and how that relates to performance in the sector. Then to touch briefly on this study we published with KPMG in December, which was the largest piece of research in this area to be published by a firm, looking at the effect of socioeconomic background on progression relative to other characteristics as well. And then to finish by touching briefly on our work in the engineering sector. All of what I'm going to share is published and available, I'm pleased to say, so I'll share the slides back with references as well. And Claire, I'm going to major on the data particularly, but also recognising the data is deeply necessary in exploring this, but not sufficient. We need the qualitative research too, of course, to understand why the data is patterned in the way it is and what we should be doing. And I'll share some reflections at the end. So to go first then into the financial services sector, this was the report we published in 2020, which was commissioned by the City of London Corporation. This research was one of a number of things that then inspired the establishment of the government-backed task force, looking at how to improve socioeconomic background in professional services and financial services in the UK. What we discovered was that in this sector, that while there was much effort taking place to diversify access, even diversity at relatively junior levels was acutely lacking by socioeconomic background, and intensely so at more senior levels. So we looked at intersectionality here as well, about the way in which socioeconomic background related to other diversity characteristics like gender and ethnicity. And so we discovered that nearly half of the senior roles across the participating organisations, which included the Bank of England, included the regulator, that nearly half of those positions were held by white males who had attended an independent or selective state school. It was one of the first reports where we looked at what we have termed the progression gap. So the difference in time, on average, it takes people from different backgrounds to progress through grades. And what we revealed in this piece of analysis was that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in financial services took, on average, 25% longer to progress through grades. This progression gap point of analysis we have come to regard as deeply important, one of the sort of biggest revealers of what's happening inside an organization. We have lots of sort of sentiment analysis through things like pulse surveys, asking people about how included they feel, how much training they can access, how supportive their manager is. Here we're starting to access data points that really get to the heart of what's actually happening, who is getting ahead, who's getting ahead most quickly, and how. So we also explored qualitatively what were some of the factors contributing to this progression gap. Many of the things emerged in this context that had emerged in Sam's context in the civil service. The headline, though, is that many of the factors that were contributing to people getting ahead, on the one hand, had very little to do with job performance. They were categorized as things like strong family alumni networks, gravitas, polish, and confidence. And let's not forget that confidence is contextual. We're confident in situations that feel familiar and comfortable. So on the one hand, they had little to do with job performance, and on the other hand, were much more available to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. A conclusion one might draw from this data is to say that simply those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds did not perform as well. Therefore, it's just and it's equal to suggest they should progress less quickly. Certainly, lots of our interviewees from lower socioeconomic backgrounds talked about the energy expended on fitting in, on assimilating to unfamiliar dominant cultures. And performance in this study was challenging, not least because of the different ways in which performance was assessed between the different organizations, and the distribution of performance data, which very typically is very grouped in the center. To put it in a slightly glib way, the majority of employees are regarded as doing just fine. Typically about 80% of employees fit within that category. So the distribution of the data means that it's statistically challenging to find significant differences in performance when we correlate them with background characteristics. That was not true in our study in the legal sector, where we had 10 of the leading law firms in the UK come together with the Bridge Group, and I should note that Sam was deeply involved in this research, over 2 years to look at early career progression in the law and who makes partner. Again, this is all published. The value of having this consortium of law firms is that on the one hand, it sort of gave them safety in numbers. I'm not sure these law firms would have published this data individually, although maybe I'm lacking generosity in saying that. But secondly, it gave us a volume of data to extrapolate some statistically significant findings. These law firms individually are fairly small, collectively they are large. So we found in this data, again, an acute lack of diversity at senior levels, so that I could have picked many stats here. The first bullet point there illustrating that more than half of partners attended an independent school. And again, we observed this progression gap, that on average, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds took 1.5 years longer, or 15% longer on average, to reach partner compared with their peers from lower and intermediate socioeconomic background. But we also found this very stark finding, which was the headline, that among graduate trainees, and many of colleagues on the call will understand the amount that law firms invest in graduate trainees over many years, the sort of element of risk that's associated with making a bad decision there. Among graduate trainees across a period of 6 years, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were much more likely to be in the top decile of performers in those law firms, but on average, much less likely to progress to associate and more likely to leave. And if they needed it, this for colleagues in the legal sector was the backbone of a business case about why neglecting this aspect of diversity would make bad business sense. I won't talk about the qualitative research here just for sake of time, Claire, to make sure there's room for discussion at the end, but I'm happy to talk about some of the factors that were contributing here to these dynamics. One, though, to reference here, because it was particularly relevant in this context, was the behaviour and preferences of clients. When we talk about workforce cultures and the way in which a dominant culture decides who gets ahead and doesn't, clearly in a profession like the law, the role that clients play is really significant. So we found in this research a real contradiction in the views about the extent to which client demands were sort of motivating or working against increased diversity and inclusion by socioeconomic backgrounds. So we heard on the one hand how clients were increasingly requesting or even demanding more diverse teams, that typically relating to gender and ethnicity, but also how clients expected to meet the right people, in inverted commas, and that was often much more rooted in socioeconomic background, and particularly using university attended as a kind of proxy for how good one might be at executing your role as a solicitor. And then to turn penultimately, Claire, to the study you referenced at KPMG. And this was an important study for us at the Bridge Group, not least because KPMG were bold in publishing it comprehensively. But there were a variety of characteristics that meant it was particularly insightful. One was the longevity of the data. So this study was the culmination of many years, much like the fast stream, many years of commitment to collecting data around socioeconomic background. So we had a sort of longevity of data to explore. In 2021, KPMG published their socioeconomic pay gaps and then published their target shortly after. And what needs to be in place for studies like this is a high proportion of people in the workforce who have chosen to voluntarily disclose their socioeconomic background. You have that apparent in the civil service. It's much less common in corporate firms, and KPMG is one of a number of the happy sort of exceptions. So we interrogated the average time taken for employees to progress between grades in the way I described earlier. We undertook this study in 2018 at KPMG and then repeated it again in 2022. So there's also a sort of time lag comparator here as well. And it includes just over 25,000 employees. So the other factors that are important in this study is the volume of people. I know 25,000 people doesn't seem very large compared with the civil service, but for a corporate firm, this is a good volume of employees to be exploring this with. And also the relatively linear way in which people progress at KPMG. We have also undertaken a similar study at the BBC, for example. As you might imagine, progression at the BBC is much less linear compared with somewhere like KPMG. Here were the findings, and here again we're illustrating the progression gap in time on average between particular groups. So the average amount of time it takes people to progress up a grade based on their demographic characteristics. So for example, if we focus on gender, in 2018, we discovered that on average, females at KPMG took 8% longer to progress through grades. In the 2022 study, they progressed very, very moderately more quickly than their male counterparts on average. But what we observed, and a similar finding, but more exaggerated amongst the ethnic minority employees as well. You can observe that in the second set of bars from the bottom. The most marked finding, though, was that socioeconomic background had the strongest effect on progression when we look at these progression gaps, but also for statisticians in the audience, we also used a modelling around regression to also understand that socioeconomic background compared with any other characteristic had a much stronger impact on progression. The volume of people in the study and the diversity of the workforce also enabled us to look at progression rates based on intersectionality. And what then emerged was a sort of relatively familiar, for want of a better word, hierarchy of progression amongst combinations of characteristics. So these are the findings at KPMG, but they're almost mirrored in our study with the BBC and with other firms that have chosen, at least to date, not to publish. So we find that those groups who progress most slowly are white females from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, black females from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and you can read the rest of this slide. I won't do karaoke. And this is to emphasize it's not about sort of diversity top trumps. We're not advocating that socioeconomic background is the characteristic that should be focused on. But we do know from this research that if we want an inclusive, diverse workforce and we don't focus on socioeconomic background, we miss a really important part of the jigsaw. And this also illustrates to us that just as we wouldn't assume that a group of people categorized by ethnicity was homogenous, so to assume that all of the people grouped under Black heritage were very, very similar to each other, we also should not assume that those categorized as lower socioeconomic background are also homogenous. They're very different. I think it's legitimate to assume that some of the barriers experienced by a Black female from a lower socioeconomic background may be quite different to those experienced by a white male from a lower socioeconomic background. And we're beginning to understand more about that through qualitative research. And then my penultimate slide, before I just share some final reflections, we looked briefly at the engineering sector here. And one of the key findings was also illuminated in what Sam has shared. So we find that people in professional roles in engineering are more diverse by socioeconomic background compared with most other professional sectors, and the class pay gap, thanks to the work of Sam and others, we observe as being smaller compared with most other professions as well. And there are a range of factors that contribute to this higher rate of diversity, including the geographical spread of roles in engineering, a greater proportion outside London compared with, for example, journalists or law, labour market demands and individual sort of perceptions. But also, we know there are several reasons why this class pay gap is less pronounced in engineering compared with other skilled professions like accountancy or law. And this really plays into some of the findings from Sam's study in the civil service. So in the latter, in accountancy and law, for example, knowledge can be relatively subjective, particularly in accountancy when we look at the advisory practice compared with something like audit or tax. And this means performance is typically harder to measure on an objective basis. And therefore it tends to put more weight on those sort of softer skills that Sam described earlier: polish, confidence, presenting as being objective. Those things which act as proxies for expertise and which often map also onto social class. In contrast, engineering is a relatively technical profession, and on that basis, it can more often be relatively meritocratically assessed in terms of performance. However, while we observed that the overall levels of diversity in engineering were better compared with some other professional sectors, we still observed this very steep sort of social gradient when it came to progression within the engineering sector. So, for example, in engineering, we know that almost 3/4 of people in their 30s from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are in managerial professional roles, compared with just 39% from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And part of what's happening there is that as you progress in engineering, your technical competency and attributes become less important, and those softer skills that Sam and I have described have greater currency. And again, we've looked at intersections, but I'll move on to my final slide. So some sort of reflections about sort of what's working, and we have published various versions with the Social Mobility Commission, a toolkit which really digs down into very sort of practical ways in which you can achieve greater socio-economic diversity and inclusion in hiring practices, in performance reviews. But here are some sort of headlines. We have observed that the narrative has changed rather positively. So that what used to be a narrative about deficit, and I'm going to use quite blunt language here for effect, that there is something wrong with a group of people and we need to help them fit in better, has generally changed into a narrative which is much more about the diversity dividend, the huge gains that firms get, for example, in the legal sector, as illustrated earlier, from hiring a more diverse group of people by socioeconomic background. And for lots of firms, the big question is, what's the task at hand here? Are you adjusting sort of practices to help a group of people kind of fit in better to a dominant culture, or are you challenging the dominant culture, which might not let people excel equally? In reality, typically, of course, both of those things are happening. And to reflect briefly on the sort of actions that we're observing as making a difference, and notice that very few of these are about sort of D&I initiatives, sort of at the margins. So we haven't much evidence, for example, that unconscious bias training makes a particular difference in this space. What we do know is that having much greater specificity about talent in hiring and performance review makes a big difference. Being explicit about, for example, what makes a good solicitor and what matters less is important in achieving greater equality around progression and in identifying sort of talent in its raw form. And we have to remember, of course, not to get too existential, but lots of these professions were shaped over many centuries by affluent white men. So we have come often to associate, what makes a good policy advisor or what makes a good lawyer with the traits we might have associated historically and currently with those of affluent white men. So specificity about talent is key here. We also find that those with most influence around people's careers are often the very people who are given the least time to manage in an inclusive way and often lack the sort of toolkit to do it. We see this sort of in extremis in professional services, where effective people management and inclusive leadership often is given very little currency. And that's an observation across the sector, not of particular organisations we work with. So it takes time to work with difference and to understand different perspectives and opinions, and time is often lacking in these work environments. We often observe in our research what we call background effects contributing to these unequal rates of progression. So what's happening in the system is less often sort of overt discrimination, although typically the sort of accumulation of microaggressions can have a significant effect on someone's well-being at work. But it's less often overt discrimination about class, but more often these background effects and work allocation, particularly who gets on the good gigs that get you ahead. Sam described that as sort of sorting within the civil service. Is really important. And where we've seen really progressive practices, it has been where firms have been able to allocate work on a much more objective skills basis than, for example, at the other end of the spectrum, reconvening teams that have been working together before because it's familiar and convenient. And then to finish, we know target setting really focuses the mind. Setting targets around socioeconomic diversity is not the same as setting quotas. We've seen KPMG and the BBC, for example, publish targets, and it really focuses minds, gives a sense of clarity about what success looks like, and sort of then enforces a discipline to be interrogating the data onwards and to be understanding what's happening within an organisation. And then finally, this consortia approach we really see as fundamental to driving change, this bringing together of organisations, and particularly, for example, with Progress Together, which is the consortium of financial services firms, and Access Accountancy, which is the consortium of accountancy firms, where we are observing really significant differences in the diversity of applicants, the success rates of particular applicants, and progression rates between firms which are ostensibly very similar. So, for example, among the big 4 accountancy firms. Now, what we are deeply interested in at the Bridge Group is what are the factors behind those differences. And it's just now we're beginning to really unpick those things as we understand the relationship between particular practices some firms have in place and the effects on inclusion and diversity by socioeconomic background. Claire, I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you both for your talks. Sam, I don't know whether your camera is off or is covered because I'm just getting a black screen. And we did see you before, so we know you're there.
You're there.
But I was just going to say, I've seen that we have some senior leaders from the Commons and the Lords on this call. So I'm going to go, before having a look through the questions, I'm going to bring in firstly our board champion in the Commons, so the board champion for ParliON, who's Grant Hill-Cawthorne. He's the Managing Director of Research and Information, and he wrote a blog after reading Navigating the Labyrinth in 2021, which we have republished today. Reflecting on the role of mentors in his own career. So I've just put the link for anyone, any parliamentary colleagues who want to read that blog, but I will bring Grant in first to kind of reflect on what you've heard today.
No, I think that's fascinating, and thank you to both of you for joining us. And so I reflect in the blog for the people that can't see that. So I was a first year university in my family, and both of my parents had, well, my father worked in a factory and I was on a single parent household. So I lived with my mother on free school meals. And what was quite apparent to me, and what is still apparent now, is a lot of people just don't know of the range of jobs available. So particularly Sam talked about policy jobs. And you know, when I was at school or even at university, I wouldn't have known what a policy job was. And so I took the easy route. I did sciences and I became a doctor, but a lot of that was because a lot of people mentored me and gave me advice along the way. So I guess my question is, going back into schools and thinking at the starting point to make sure that people are on the correct ladder, how do we actually portray these fairly hidden professions that we're talking about? Things like, what does it mean to be a lawyer? What does it mean to be a policy analyst, and how do we explain that in schools, particularly for schools that don't typically send people to the civil service? Best to Sam? Yeah, okay.
Sam, shall I kick off and then?
Yeah, go for it, Nick.
I have the disadvantage of not being able to see your body language.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know why. It says my camera's on. Sorry, this has not been a masterclass in technology from me today.
So Grant, thanks for your question and also sharing some of your own background as well. Interestingly, this is one of the key things that came up in our research with the FAR stream in 2016, which was about the lack of understanding amongst school pupils and, equally importantly, careers advisors in schools, to the extent they exist, on what a civil servant does. I think we also sometimes fall into the trap of talking about school pupils lacking sort of aspiration. Many of the school pupils I meet don't lack aspiration, and nor do their parents. What they lack is information and access to opportunities. And so one of the pieces of advice that we've given lots of employers where the sort of profession might be more opaque. So it's similarly true of, advisory at a firm like KPMG. I mean, what does that mean? To put it frankly, I didn't know what it meant until I started working with them. I think the case study approach is invaluable. So we encouraged, FAR streamers to go into schools and talk about the role that they played in particular instances that were sort of relatable for the students. The Olympics, for example, was a great example. Every school pupil knew what that was, but understanding the role that someone played in that process was hugely helpful. Similarly, we've had people from financial services talking about the role that they've played in sort of world events and talked about their different perspective on it and what they've done. So I think lots of ways is the honest answer, but I think the case study approach is particularly helpful, and where those case studies are sort of resonant for young people.
That's really interesting. Sam, do you have a response?
No, I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think obviously one of the challenges, I think it's absolutely right that those sorts of information sessions that you do in schools is useful for demystifying. I think one of the challenges, though, is that when we talk about something like the civil service, those sorts of accelerator roles, those ways through the labyrinth are so specific and complex that I think, you know, probably the most effective moment to scaffold that information, because it's so specialized, is probably when people are entering the civil service rather than necessarily in schools. I think that's when probably I think it would have the most impact.
Great,
And
thank you both.
I think talking there about demystifying language, the next person I'm going to ask to bring in is the clerk assistant in the Commons. And for anyone who doesn't work in Parliament, won't know what the that role. They'll have no idea what that role refers to. But it's I'd say you're a parliamentary equivalent of the second permanent secretary for the House of Commons. So Sarah Davis, who I know has been thinking a lot about this subject. So Sarah, do you want to come in with any thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I began as a fast streamer with as an assistant clerk, and now I'm clerk assistant 30 years later. So I mean, yeah, that's quite opaque. Really interested to come to this session and to hear from both of you. And as Claire said, I'm clerk assistant in the Commons and also managing director of our very large chamber and participation team. And I'm from a kind of small town, first generation to university, kind of free school meals background. And when I read Navigating the Labyrinth in particular, you know, a couple of months ago, there were two things that really hit home for me. And the first was this point about downplaying privilege or kind of exaggerating origin stories, which I think is a very human kind of thing to do sometimes. You know, there are lots of very interesting aspects of that on the chat, kind of like either way. I think a lot of that comes from a kind of fitting in one way or t'other. And I think one of the interesting aspects of that is around the definitions and the evolving definitions of social mobility. And my first question was, I wonder whether you think that the way those definitions are evolving and either being simplified or perhaps being kind of developed are actually helping with that process, as in making people make more careful judgments about how they describe where they came from, and make more careful judgments about how they describe that to others. And then my second thing was about cultural reference points, and this is very much plays on into how people think they are navigating the labyrinth, and it also relates to the comments you made at the end, Nick. And I mean, I joined 30 years ago as a fast streamer, and people, when I say that to people, they said, gosh, that must be really hard working as a woman in the House of Commons at that time. And I say, no, that was fine. There were actually senior women around to look up to. It was a very supportive environment. But what the kicker was joining as a kind of football loving, pint drinking science fiction geek as 22-year-old with a completely different set of humour reference points, leisure pursuits, books I'd read, films I'd watched, knowledge of grammar. It was a completely different world. And I think our diversity has changed a lot in the House, but I think there are aspects of value judgments on qualities which I think are very persistent. And I see it in how we describe what types of people are a kind of a good proceduralist or a kind of a deep thinker. And my question is there, how do we politely and firmly continue to push back against those kind of constructions, you know, that you have to have a certain set of cultural reference points to be a clever person? Thank you.
Those are fantastic questions. I'll try and just tackle them both quickly, and then let Nick come in. I mean, I should make clear this issue about deflecting privilege is really complex, and I think I reduced it to a very short anecdote there, but it fascinates me, and I think something that actually needs to be unpicked in a lot of detail. I mean, the first thing to say is that I think this is not something that people are doing in a sort of cynical way. This reflects we grow up hearing stories about our families, right? And they inform our sense of our identity, and those stories are often multi-generational. So I don't think it's a sort of cynical thing. I think that the issue with it is that perhaps we, to pick up on what you were saying, are slowly starting to have a better handle on kind of relationally what the socio-economic makeup of the UK looks like, in ways that perhaps in the past, because class was even more of a taboo than it is today was obscured, and I think that's why there's a sort of drip of information through the media, through diversity and inclusion, through culture, that perhaps helps people to understand in a more accurate way where they sit, and to reflect a little bit more on where they sit, but to be clear on measurement, there is no silver bullet. And I think somebody in the chat asked about, parental occupation versus the other types of measures. I think both Nick and I would advocate for, collecting as much information as possible and examining data in as much depth as possible, because there are always interesting storylines in the data. And I think, the reason why we tend to use parental occupation is that it's in various ways, I think theoretically as well as in practice in terms of predicting outcomes, tends to be the best single proxy for looking at a person's background. And then on the cultural reference points, 100%, I think the question is always trying to throw back to the people who are in a sort of fairly taken for granted way, sort of perpetuating those value judgments around culture, to throw the question back about, in what ways can you really justify a sense of certain types of cultural touch points being inherently superior? As a sociologist of culture, I've been sort of grappling with this stuff for 20 years, and philosophically, I think you find over time there is very little basis for really why some forms of culture are considered higher or not. So I think that it's a really important thing to kind of keep questioning and keep throwing out there in discussion, because I think if it doesn't people get into this situation whereby they feel this sense that there is this prevailing sense that there is some touch points that are more valuable than others, and that then means that fairly essential parts of who they are and what they do and what their identity is need to be kind of censured in the workplace.
I'll be super brief, not least because I've got to go pick up my kids in 2 minutes. On the sort of misinterpreting signals of talent, Sarah, on misinterpreting highbrow references as good job performance, I think that comes back to my earlier comments. That's not unconscious bias. That's bias. It's conscious bias, and I think we can train ourselves out of that. Frankly, I think it's about those who are, those who have been given the responsibility to assess performance, being vigilant about how they assess signals of talent and what matters and what matters less. And I think that point about specificity about talent is really key here. It's not easy. I'm making it sound very straightforward, but ultimately it's about that. It's about good talent management. It's about leaders having the space and time to do that effectively and vigilantly.
Thank you, and apologies that we have run over, and thank you for staying on. I did want to bring in someone from the Lords. I just want to thank Simon Burton, who's our Clerk of the Parliament, for being here and listening to this as well. So that's the equivalent of the Permanent Secretary to the House of Lords, who's been here as well. So I think there's a lot that Parliament can learn from this. And we said at the beginning, before we started this meeting, Sam, that we know that you'd been interested in looking at doing something similar with Parliament as you did for navigating the labyrinth. And I think the interest in this area is definitely growing, and the fact we have Sarah and Simon and Grant on this call shows that. And so it'd be great to kind of keep in touch with you both, but I know you're super busy with a book at the moment, and good luck with that, and we look forward to you publishing that. But yeah, I just want to thank everyone who stayed on. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for the brilliant talk. Apologies for the technology, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of this Social Mobility Awareness Day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Claire.